Well, this morning on Media and Society, we look at the state of investigative journalism in Africa. And SA media groups demand that Google, Facebook pay them for news content. And we ask, where do you get your news from in this digital age? Well, hello and welcome to Media and Society on SABC News, independent and impartial. My name is Naledi Muleo. Now, this is where we look at the intersection between the media and audiences. And of course, as per usual, the show is not complete without your say. So do connect with us via our social media channels and share your views and concerns about how the media works and what we feed you. Hashtag Media and Society is the tag to use on Twitter, or give us a call throughout this hour on 011-714-6841 or 6842. Well, today we're taking a look at the state of investigative journalism in Africa and on the continent. Now, the Global Investigative Journal says journalists in Southern Africa face numerous obstacles that include funding struggles, state censorship, and even legal intimidation. So we asked some of you about your thoughts and the confidence that you have in the state of investigative journalism in South Africa. Let's take a look. Now, recently, Nigerian investigative journalist Tobora Ovore wrote that female investigative journalists face violence and threats. This despite the editor and publisher publication saying good investigative journalism is an essential part of democracy. Take a look at this.
The second question is about the national minimum wage. Can the ANC possibly share the figures with us, or?
Yeah, well, the show, again, is not complete without your contribution. So give us a call on 011-714-6841 or 6842. And once again, that hashtag SABC Media and Society. Well, let's have this discussion. Let's get straight into it. I am now joined by Paulie van Wyk from the Daily Mavericks, the Scorpio investigative team. Paulie, a good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm also joined by Solomon Sewanja, who's the executive director for the Africa Institute for Investigative Journalism. He is, of course, based in Kampala in Uganda. Solomon and Paulie, thank you so much for joining us. Paulie, I'm going to start with you because I think here at home you're a familiar face. We know some of the work that you've done in investigative journalism in the country. I think just from an overall point of view, right, one of the things I raised earlier was the resources that we have for investigative journalists in South Africa. What is your view on where we sit on that? Could more be done in terms of us having more capacity?
Yes, absolutely, and good morning. Obviously, funding is always the lifeblood of any business, and journalism is a business too. It's more a philanthropic business, and its outcomes and goals are different. Our only allegiance are to the people of South Africa, or in Solomon's case, the people of who he writes for. So in this instance, it's definitely something that we, as Daily Maverick, specifically need much more of. Our funding model is interesting, and it's an award-winning funding model where we are the first, definitely in sub-Saharan Africa, to have started a Maverick Insiders program of our own readers who fund us and give us money. We have about 20,000 people doing that. Then we have adverts, which is more a traditional kind of way of earning money in our paper and online. We have subscriptions to our online base. It's interesting because we are free to air and we have no paywall. But it's again the philanthropic nature of especially Daily Mavericks journalism that we ask our readers for contributions, and they often do that.
Yeah. Okay, Paulie, we seem to have lost Paulie for a moment there, but as we try and get her back, let's continue speaking to Solomon, who joins us now from Kampala. My brother, a good morning to you. Thank you so much for giving us your time. Give us perhaps a little bit of an overview of what investigative journalism looks like, perhaps in Uganda and in the greater region on the continent, particularly from a resource point of view.
Yeah, well, I think that Paulie was right on the money. I think we celebrate Maverick as well for coming up with that funding model where the readers contribute to the investigative journalism. That's absolutely fantastic. And we don't have that here in Uganda. What we have, though, is that a lot of the money that has been going into investigative projects have largely been with support from international media.
Solomon, are you still there? Okay. Seems like we're having some network issues there. Just a second, Solomon.
The BBC.
Solomon, I'm having a little bit of trouble with your bandwidth there. It seems that it's low. So as we try and just reboot that connection to you, this is always the challenge, of course, with using Zoom. These things will happen. We'll try and get you a brand new line so that we can get you a clearer one. Paulie, if we come back to South Africa, I know that you're certainly one of those journalists that faces a lot of criticism. I mean, what is some of the biggest criticism that you face? And I think a great place perhaps to even take the conversation is why investigative journalism is so important and why you think you face so much criticism as investigative journalists in South Africa.
Well, we tread on sensitive toes, Naledi. That's the problem. So the criticism against me has never once actually been on the facts of what I wrote. But the criticism are things like I'm a witch, the witch should be burning, I should be raped and hanged, and I'm targeting black people because I'm white, or I'm writing about white people because someone paid me. So it's an interesting mix of things that has nothing to do with the facts that I actually write. And it obviously stems from when we analyze it, from the people and the supporters that we write about. So when I write about Charles Salier, who ran a massive insurance scam from partly with VBS money, around 1.7 billion rand, he thinks that I'm being I have an agenda. And when I write about Julius Malema and Floyd Shivambu, they think I'm racist and tell me that I'm a witch and should be burning. So it's an interesting mix of angry people who we are not allowing to get away with their criminality. And that's why they criticize us, and never on the facts, and they never take us to court. I've never been taken to court, even though I invited it.
Well, we're gonna keep sitting on that issue for a little bit, because there's so much to unpack there, Paulie. And we tweeted a question as well just a few days ago, asking you what your thoughts are on the quality of investigative media. During the week, we asked, what is your thoughts on the quality of investigative media? And a lot of the thoughts that came in on social media talked about where the funding is coming from. Is there an agenda behind investigative journalists in the country? So we're going to unpack that issue a little bit more and also share some of those tweets. But Solomon, a little bit earlier, you talked about the funding that you receive, and I'll let you finish that thought. But perhaps the more noisy criticism that investigative journalists get across the continent.
Well, can I say that, just going back to the funding bit, that big investigative projects have been largely funded by international media houses, like, for example, the BBC, which had the BBC Africa Eye funding many of the investigations across the African continent. However, that project was supposed to end in 2020. And so what does that mean? Does that mean that no more investigative stories will come through? I mean, let's look at Al Jazeera that had Al Jazeera Africa Investigates. That project took closed. Now, when you look at investigative journalism, it requires some really good funding, a lot of it, for you to be able to get a good story. Then is that, can our media houses internally be able to fund investigative projects? Many of the stories.
Oh, Solomon, I'm really trying here. I really am, and I'm struggling with that line. Oh, this is so disappointing, because such an important conversation, particularly where the continent is concerned. But what we're going to do is we're going to start bringing up some of those tweets then and seeing what South Africans actually had to say about social media, particularly what they felt about the work of investigative journalists. One tweet says, we don't have. If there was one investigative journalist before, it was destroyed by the powers that be, those with deep pockets. We have fake ones, hence the fake news phenomenon. Another tweet coming up there as soon as we are able to bring them up. And of course, you can send your thoughts with us to us as well at hashtag SABC Media and Society. Let's see. Skilo on Twitter says, what journalism? Because they're only good for gossip and lies. They're now paid to destroy good leaders. Another tweet from Kajimpi says, I stopped watching news because of investigative journalists. This is how much I trust them. Another tweet from G-Man says, I will give the journalists the benefit of the doubt and prove my disappointment to their boss, who approves the stories they're working on. Those bosses are the ones depriving us of good content, as they don't give freedom to journalists to work on good topics. Very interesting. Another tweet that says, we don't have investigative journalists, we have reporters. Or give us a call and share your thoughts. That number to call is 011-714-6841 or 6842. Be part of the discussion and share your thoughts on the quality of investigative journalism in South Africa, and particularly what stories you'd really want investigative journalists to focus on. We've got Solomon and Paulie here. Perhaps they'll take some of those suggestions on what it is you want them really to go dig up, stories that stand out for you, and whether perhaps you'd like to share your thoughts on how they were treated. Paulie, I'm going to come to you because, you know, some of the criticism that you've received, particularly from some of the leaders in the country, has been the approach that you've used in investigating stories. I mean, I go back to investigative journalists at some point being accused of going through the rubbish bins of particular political leaders. I wonder where the sort of limitations are for investigative journalists to operate. I mean, at this point, we've got this sort of legislation like the Poppy Act. What are the restrictions that do make your work particularly difficult from a legislative point of view?
So we have the Constitution, which is obviously our guideline. And the Constitution states that we have freedom of media and freedom of information in Section 16. But my favorite part of Section 16 of the Constitution is actually the freedom to receive information. And that is something that I always take to heart. That is the heart of journalism, is we offer people information that they never would have known, and we give them the option to know and then to base their life decisions on the way their world is structured. So we assist them in understanding their world, in essence. So the leaders then that we write about would be in business. We would write about politics and about healthcare, education, and the things that our readers find important. This week for Daily Maverick, for example, we wrote about the Glencore scandal, where they just admitted to severe criminality in the US. We wrote about several people being arrested from the police side, so senior police officials, generals, colonels, brigadiers, arrested in a supply chain management scandal, corruption and fraud against them. We wrote a lot about education, and something very important at the moment that we're picking up is how vigilante violence in the country is increasing, and how doctors in different hospitals in Cape Town, Bloemfontein and Johannesburg say that the severity of injuries have increased remarkably, and it looks like a war zone. So these things are important, and it's important for our people to know what kind of leaders they have, who they chose as leaders, and what the political structure looks like. So whether it's not always nice to hear that, and that is perhaps the problem when we write about the Zumas or the Mkizes or Gwedi Mantashes of this world, or maybe Julius Malema. You know, it's not nice to hear that the person that you chose, and perhaps that very last hope that you have for a politician to do good, it's not nice to hear that that person is actually corrupt. And that is the essence of a lot of the criticism that stems from that and that we receive. And especially that they don't like the approach that you touched on, because we should rather write about the ANC, or we should rather write about the DA, or when we write about the DA, we should rather write about the EFF. So we will always be criticized, and we realize that. But in the end, we are independent, and our only allegiance is to the country.
Paulie talked a little bit earlier about how she has had readers and people tweet publicly that she should be raped and violently assaulted because of the work that she does. And that then takes me to the issue of safety, just on the continent. I mean, if this is an issue in South Africa, what is that looking like on the continent, Solomon? And your biggest concerns for the safety of investigative journalists, and who are some of their greatest threats?
So first of all, I should say that, Paulie, I celebrate you, my fellow colleague, the fact that you can withstand that pressure and that abuse, because Paulie is a human. So every time you read such tweets, they're disheartening, but you got to soldier on. I mean, there's a 5 million bounty on Anas Aremia, or Anas's head in West Africa, for the big investigations that have happened. Here in Uganda, I have been arrested multiple times for the investigative stories that I've done. John Allan Namu in Kenya, for example, has had to flee the country after doing some investigations that have been critical of the state. So the issue of safety is very serious, I should add. And this is why our newsrooms need to invest heavily in securing the journalists, because we put our lives on the line by going to places where others fear. And when we expose the corrupt come back biting, and they bite hard sometimes. We've lost so many journalists across the continent, and which is why safety for investigative journalists is important.
Yeah. Well, we're going to unpack.
We've seen in the past is that your houses tell you what is your next story, what is your biggest story after you publish this one, without paying attention to your safety.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point there. People want to know what you're working on next, and very little regard for the safety of investigative journalists. Listen, we're gonna come back and finish this conversation. Perhaps when we come back, we'll have a discussion around public perceptions around investigative journalists. Do you trust them? Give us a call, 011-714-6841. We're back after this. Welcome back. Remember, we continue our discussion on the state of investigative journalism in South Africa and as well as on the continent. We're keen to hear your thoughts. Do you trust the work of investigative journalists? And of course, perhaps you'd like to share some thoughts on what it is that you'd like to see them work on next. Tweet #Media and Society, or give us a call on 011-714-6841 or 011-714-6842. Let's take a look at some more of those tweets. It was a big week on Twitter with this discussion. One tweet says, I think it's Tomo Miles says, we no longer have investigative journalism in the country, either a black, white or Zimbabwean. They always push propaganda, paid journalism to influence public opinion. Look what is happening with Glencore. It's like we don't have journalists because Cyril is the darling of the media. Tammy S says, there is no investigative journalism. I don't even read any newspapers or news from mainstream media due to lies and open bias. Sure. Another tweet from El Papi says, the entire industry needs cleansing. They co-opted by ANC factions. They serve as a mouthpiece of WMC establishment. They should have a cleansing ceremony. Slaughter a black bull. When ANC becomes part of our history, so should they. We need new media rooted into Africanism. Sure. Jacques says, challenge is journalism is so tainted by media houses' corrupt activities that it's hard to trust what is being published. Worse, SA media houses have all seemed to be under one ownership, fighting another media house. When a great story is written, it is shadowed by tabloid. And Zwane says, zero. By the way, there's none in South Africa. It's only political parties and factional journalism. Yeah. So I mean, those are some of the tweets that have come in. Those are some of the tweets that have come in. Let's continue our discussion quickly with Paulie van Wyk and Solomon Sewanja, who's the Executive Director for the Africa Institute for Investigative Journalism. Paulie, the tweets are talking about a political bias in the country. I mean, what do you say to that? A lot of people simply not trusting media generally because they feel that particular media houses have certain political biases and agendas. How do we deal with that narrative?
Well, it's interesting that you only have negative comments, but because we have very positive comments and people that really support us. You know, if people don't think that your journalism is valuable, you will not be read and you will not be funded. And at the moment, we are not struggling with any of that. So I think we really take good care to write across the spectrum. We use contributors like Amabungani and Ground Up to assist in Open Secrets, to assist even wider with our content. So there's no way that we can be accused of being politically factional or having agenda, because we've criticized across the board every political party in the country, and we've written really good things about them too. The investigative journalism that we do, obviously, refers to the current political environment quite a lot. So the ANC does bear the brunt of it, but they are in government, and that's important. What the good things that came out of our journalism specifically is that Daily Maverick were the ones who started the Gupta Leaks investigations, along with, and we pulled in partners Amabungani and News 24. And the Zondo Commission is something that was a direct result of our reporting of that. The Nugent Commission into SARS, for example, was also a direct link to what I wrote about for 4 years in SARS and the decline of governance under the leadership of Tom Moyane and Jonas Makwakwa from 2014 and 2018. So we have a really vibrant culture in South Africa of investigative journalism, and I personally find that people have high regard for us and that they think that we do really good work. The problem that we do have, and where we cannot shy away from, is when you have journalism that refers to 10 babies being born, the 10 couplets, and then you can't prove that they actually exist. And that really is problematic for journalism as a whole. And then I can understand that people do not believe us and that they feel that we have some sort of an agenda.
Yeah, and the questions does still remain, where are the Tembisa 10? But that's a discussion for another day. Solomon, if I come to you quickly, you know, one of the issues that Paulie's talked about is the far-reaching implications of investigative journalism. You know, the Gupta leaks eventually having led to a commission of inquiry and massive changes that have happened in the country. What are some of those moments that we've seen on the rest of the continent? Perhaps particularly you've got some ideas from Uganda, where investigative journalism has had that massive trickle-down effect.
Listen, this is why I find those comments mean, because when you have a team of investigative journalists that publish a very big investigation that has had big impact like that, right now Zuma is in court trying to, plead not guilty and struggling for his life. That's a big impact out of the investigations. Here in Uganda, we had several top government officials arrested as a result of investigative stories. In Kenya, for example, John Allan Namu, having participated in the recent leaks, President Uhuru Kenyatta came out to speak up against his involvement in investing in offshore accounts in Kenya. In Ghana, Anasa Nassin's investigations have led to a whole judiciary being put down. So I believe that investigative journalists have done absolutely well in trying to expose the rot in our societies. In Uganda, my recent investigation around the misuse of the COVID-19 money that was meant to procure vaccines has led to a big inquiry by Parliament here. I believe that investigative journalism has a big role to play, and indeed our role as being a watchdog to the state. And I think that we have done well on the continent. And the better we just need support and not criticism and not that negative energy, because we put ourselves on the line to expose these issues.
Yeah. Solomon, thank you so much for that. Well, let's take a call because we've got some real interest in this discussion. We've got a caller, Baba from East London. Baba, good morning to you.
Yes, morning. How are you?
I'm well. Thank you so much for calling.
Okay. Yeah, I've got a concern about the investigation journalism.
Yes.
They are not working that 100%. Maybe they've got fears, fears of unknown because we are not in that space. The reason I'm saying that is, if you can come down and investigate in East London or in the Eastern Cape, there is a lot of corruption. I don't know whether to say corruption or rot, but it's something like that. For instance, now, if you can go in one of our hospitals, which is Frey Hospital, it's a disaster what is happening there. I'm not scared to name it. It's a disaster. The hospital is collapsing. Yeah. And there is a new hospital next to Frey that was built using the resources of Frey Hospital. We tried, at that time I was still working at Frey. We tried to report, even we have involved, even the journalism, we took photos of the metals that were cut, that were sending water to that hospital. But there was nothing that was done.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much for raising that. Because thank you so much for calling as well. That's Baba in East London, and you can be part of the conversation as well. 0117146841. That brings me to this idea that we are at a point where the public is saying, yes, investigative journalists are doing their work at a mass scale, right? And they're looking at some of the macro issues in the country. But when you get down to the local regions, people are seeing rampant corruption in their areas. Are we at a point, Paulie, where the public is starting to hope that the investigations will come from journalists instead of police? Because it sounds like this is work that corruption at local government level is something that really should be done by law enforcement.
Yeah, absolutely. And in big ways, we really did take over the work of police, because every story that the Zondo Commission has unraveled and every theme that they've investigated have been started by investigative journalists in Daily Maverick, Amabungani, Sunday Times, and some of the Afrikaans newspapers. It's absolutely true. I couldn't hear everything that Baba said, and I would invite him to please contact Daily Maverick so that we can help, because we have a really good journalist who sit in Nelson Mandela Bay and write about the region. But recently we wrote a lot about water and the disasters going on there, especially relating to water infrastructure. This week specifically, I also wrote about private business people being arrested along with top cops, generals, colonels and brigadiers, because they are in East London and Port Elizabeth, because they were corrupt and fraudulently stole money from the police. So that region, Nelson Mandela Bay specifically, is really important for us. And I'm busy focusing on water infrastructure in that area too. So if Baba really have a problem, please contact us. We would love to hear what you have to say and what is going on the ground.
Yeah, we'll hope to get your contact details, Baba. That's the lady who just did call in. If we did not get your contact number, call us back so we can pass your number on to Paulie. Solomon, I'm gonna bring that same question to you and say, well, we hear Baba saying, well, at local level, we need more investigative journalism. And I'm sure that's a call you hear quite often as well. What does that do for the faith that people have in law enforcement versus how they view investigative journalists? And I'm sure it pins you up against law enforcers.
Well, certainly it does. Every single day, investigative journalists, including myself, get calls from the community members. I mean, sometimes I get to sit and think, am I God? You know, every single time you have a person who is calling you on issues of healthcare, the other person is calling you on electricity. Sometimes you're overwhelmed. Another one tells you about corruption in the court system. And then you're thinking to yourself, where do I start from? Especially considering the resources that you have to do some of these investigations. And it's indeed true that we take up some of those, but others, there's nothing we can do about them, because for you to take a deep dive into an issue, you require resources, you require time to investigate it. And I think even when we come up with these, when I did an investigation, for example, recently, of how the judiciary was compromised in a defilement case, where, for example, the police officer was supposed to investigate a defilement case, became an accomplice. And was corrupted to change the evidence on file that was sent to the Directorate of Public Prosecution, and therefore the person who defiled the baby was set free. Now, in such a case, when you're doing that investigation, the police pushes back because they don't want to be implicated in such an investigation, because they are supposed to do the investigations themselves. So it becomes a very complicated puzzle, and therefore the public stops trusting the police and starts to trust us. And that way you have so many people calling in, and sometimes you can do so much. This is why we need support from the audience. We need support to, for example, give financial support to, for example, Daily Maverick, subscribe to them, create, for example, a fund for investigative journalists. You have heard how people are saying
let me jump in there, because
the investigative journalism is very low, but the support towards it
and the capacity, and we've talked about the capacity. Solomon, I'm sorry, I need to just jump in there.
Support from the public. Until when we get to a time that we stop complaining about the quality of investigative journalism and support the investigative journalism to improve, then we can have more journalists doing more investigative stories in public interest.
So, I mean, listen, you've talked about the issue of capacity, and we certainly have gotten a few examples on how we can deal with that, where Paulie said, have a fund where the readers themselves perhaps contribute to that fund, and it's certainly an idea. But let's hear just one more caller. Amtwi is on the line from Kimberley. Amtwi, good morning to you.
Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning. Thanks for calling.
You're welcome, ma'am.
What's your thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to make a short comment here. I've been listening to what is going on there. Investigative journalism is a very good they expose the corrupt officials, but then some of them, in the end, they tend to become corrupt. As they are able to face out some issues, they now come up with issues that if you give me 1, 2, 3, I keep quiet. And in such cases, they are trying to fight corruption, but then they become corrupt. So they should avoid those things and then do the good job that they are doing. Thank you.
Okay, and that's a fair point. Thank you so much. And that's essentially a point that's saying investigative journalists are doing important work exposing the corrupt, but beware that you are not influenced by those corrupt officials yourselves as journalists. And I think that that's a responsibility we're all very much aware of. And we're going to leave it there, but it's definitely a conversation that can continue on social media. Hashtag SABC Media and Society. Thank you so much to my guests, Paulie van Wyk from Daily Maverick Scorpio Investigative Team, as well as Solomon Siwanja, Executive Director for the Africa Institute for Investigative Journalism. Let's take a short break. We're back in a moment. Welcome back. So many people get their news these days on Facebook, on Google and other digital platforms. But these organizations don't pay for the access they give to the public through their platforms. So now the Publisher Support Service wants them to pay. Well, we ask some of you, where do you get your news from?
My source of news comes from the radio, TV and social media. So basically every morning I listen to radio from like 5 o'clock in the morning, and then after I hear one side of the story from one media house, then I turn to another channel on TV, then I listen, and I also get some of my news from social media, newspapers. So I just try to collect from different types of like medias. I don't like get from one source of media because I want to hear different types of the stories from both all sides.
Nna ditaba nako e ngata ke di thola ko social media, bo Twitter, bo Instagram, and now ke di thola haholo ko TikTok. Because now my phone is always with me, so as soon as I get that notification, I check to see what's really happening behind us.
Social media, which is Twitter, Facebook, newspaper.
From social media most of the time, because it's easy to have access on it. I always have my phone.
I prefer going straight to the websites because that's where you get your like the rawness of izindaba. Most of the people before it goes on television, it's gonna start on social media. It's gonna trend on social media.
Yeah, very interesting, and particularly interesting to see that you've got South Africans across the strata of age, across the spectrum of age, all going to digital platforms now to access or get news information. But South African media practitioners aren't the first to ask for a law or for some governance of Google and other tech platforms on the news they provide and receive from third parties. A similar issue, in fact, led to Facebook shutting off news from the platform in Australia just for a short while last year. Well, let's discuss this further. I'm joined on the line, rather via Zoom, by Kate Skinner from the Association for Independent Publishers. I'm also joined by Nelisa Ngulana, who is the founder of PR Trends ZA. Ladies, good morning to you both, and thank you so much for speaking to us. Kate, I think I want to start with you and really start from a place of understanding the business behind it, right? You heard the viewers saying, I get my news first from Twitter or Facebook or whatever it may be. But publishers and media houses are upset with this. How are media houses being hurt by this? Let's start there.
Okay, so I think it's really important to say that, who produces the news and current affairs, who employs the journalists, who go out and do the investigations, and hold the different organizations and government and everybody to account. It's basically the media organizations that do that work, and it's expensive work, to get qualified journalists with all of those skills, the critical thinking skills plus all the tech skills. It costs money. And the big issue is that the problem has been that the media houses and the publishers that produce this very, very critical content are not actually getting properly compensated for that. What has happened is that most of the advertising revenue actually goes to the platforms, and yet those are not the people that are actually producing the content. And so we as publishers have basically been saying we need a fairer share of advertising. And the reason why we need a fairer share of advertising is because we need to continue to produce this absolutely critical news content. And if we don't, it just means that society is poorer, democracy is poorer. So that is what, in a nutshell, the battle is about.
Yeah, Nellis, I know you've studied the area of how people consume their media quite extensively. Should these platforms be paying media houses for this content? And, I suppose where I get stuck is what that structure would even look like.
Good morning, Lady, and good morning to your viewers. And I think, as Kate rightly put it, there is quite a lot that goes into creating that content. The current remuneration model, the revenue model between the platforms and the publishers of content is definitely not equitable enough as it is, because this content also does obviously contribute to the growth of these platforms at zero cost for them. However, obviously the platforms are making, an argument for themselves that they are simply helping people find news, so that their platforms are actually leading people back to publishers to publishers' websites. And they also claim that they are obviously investing and supporting news outlets globally in terms of making sure that, they provide training and some other funding support. So I guess the question is this enough? What could a new model look like?
Yeah, Kate, I'm going to give that hot potato to you because it's a tough one, right? What the new model could possibly look like. I touched a little bit earlier on what happened in other parts of the globe, where in Europe and Australia there were agreements on some compensation. Perhaps you can talk to me about what you understand those agreements to have looked like, some ideas on what that can look like in a South African context.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great question, and we actually have to get to the heart of that. What does this model look like? And I think, there are various ways that things can be done. But one of the big things I think is important is that you have to have proper negotiations between the platforms and the publishers. And so I think what's been interesting is that the, Publishers Support Services, which represents all the big publishers, and now we as the Association of Independent Publishers are also joining up. So basically what you need is proper negotiations between the platforms and the publishers. And, at the moment, there's such a power inequity. I mean, the platforms are so powerful and the publishers are not. And so what you're wanting is a situation where they are compelled to actually negotiate with us, and that there are actually, there's arbitration. So if you can't come up with a solution that makes sense, there is arbitration, and, all parties have to negotiate and then come up with a solution. So I think those are the kinds of things that PSS, are looking at. And also, I mean, what are we actually wanting? We're wanting more funding to come to the news operations, because at the moment what is happening is that the news operations are so starved of funds that basically they are retrenching journalists, and the numbers of journalists that have been retrenched it's actually frightening. And if you have no journalists, you're going to have no proper news. Yeah. So it's that negotiations and it's that funding that then collectively is then transferred to the news operations.
Yeah,
let me leave it there.
Yeah, I mean it's a start, I suppose. It's a start. Nelisa, let me come to you. Because we run the risk right now of having a conversation that is between ourselves as the media and then wanting to get money from the social media giants, and the people at home are watching and thinking, well, I'm quite happy to get my news where I get it. So why should this matter for them, right? Whether or not these social media giants do pay a publisher for content, when the public is quite happy with what they're getting, Nelisa.
So I think obviously the danger that we run into is that these platforms also become the content creators, which obviously puts us in a very difficult and tricky position. I think the independence that comes with having content that is created by, journalists and independent news producers is very critical for the public discourse. We know how powerful a space platforms such as Google and Facebook and Twitter are in terms of, what news makes it onto people's mobile phones, what conversations people are having, and most importantly, what decisions people are making, even around critical times such as during elections, etc. So we don't want to find ourselves in a situation where Facebook is, for example, is the source of the news and the distributor of the news and the platform for the news, because it does play quite a worrying effect on community.
Yeah. What is it that the South African leadership can do, Kate? I go back to 2020, and I remember during the hard lockdown watching Mark Zuckerberg attempt to account to lawmakers in the US and being asked some very difficult questions. And I remember looking at that and thinking to myself, are we anywhere close to getting there in the South African context where lawmakers can actually sit with some of these digital tech giants and ask them some of those big questions around information dissemination, data sharing, and even just the role they play in molding our news, Kate?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that you basically need to be talking about issues of power.
Yeah.
And I think one of the big things that is critical is that you need all the different publishers to come together, because I'm just thinking about our tiny publishers all over the country. I mean, they are really, really small, and they're tiny little towns. And I mean, if they were trying to go up against Facebook or Google, they just wouldn't have a hope. But if you basically get all the big media publishers in the country, and you get all our tiny little publishers from the Association of Independent Publishers, for instance, and you put all of us together, that's when you have power. So it's the central issue of the collective power of the publishers coming together and saying, then you're talking about real audiences, you're talking about significant numbers of people. And at that point, then you can start to hold, the tech giants to account. You can start to look at negotiating something that starts to benefit publishers. And I think that's what is really exciting about this initiative with PSS, is the fact that not operating as just tiny little individuals or even big, individual companies. You're bringing everybody together. And that, I think, is the start of the possibility of having these negotiations.
And just quickly, Kate, in your discussions...
Yeah, and I think in addition to that...
sorry, Nelisa, I just wanted to jump in there quickly.
I think the competition...
Sorry, Nelisa, I just wanted to give a follow-up question to Kate, and I'll let you finish there. Just tell me, in your discussions with, say, Facebook and Google, how easy has it been for you to access them, Kate, and have those conversations?
Oh, incredibly difficult. And I mean, it's interesting. I mean, as tiny publishers, I mean, we haven't had really any opportunity at all. I mean, I think the bigger players have had more opportunity, but that's been a real problem up until now, is very little possibility to actually negotiate.
Very difficult. Nelisa, you wanted to step in there?
Yes, so I was saying, in addition to obviously the publishers organizing amongst themselves and trying to obviously be united in their quest around this, the government can obviously support that by pushing the relevant legislation. Countries such as Australia have passed a law to make these platforms pay for news content. In France, they're using copyright agreements as a way to kind of push revenue. So there are different ways to pursue this. And I think the Competition Commission is trying to put together something to kind of assess what that could look like in our market.
Yeah. Why should the viewer care, and do we have a role to play, Kate, in this discussion? And I say that because I go back to lessons that we've learned from the international market, where we've seen some of these giants really start to influence the way people see even political movements in some parts of the world. So what is the role of the public? I mean, we say all the time, hold the media accountable for the work that we do. How can these giants be held accountable by the public, Kate?
So, I mean, I think what is really critical, and you touched on these, before, is that what you're needing the kind of public to understand that, where do they get their content? And it's a powerful point that Nelisa was making about the fact that, you don't want a situation where the platforms are producing content. You're needing South Africans to be producing South African content about our context. And it's really important that the public understands that is where the content comes from and where the content needs to come from. And actually, if you're talking about deepening democracy in this country, that is, the news media produced by South Africans is absolutely critical. And I think that sometimes you're right. I think people, everybody in this conversation has said, people don't really care. I don't know, I get my content from wherever I get my content, from Facebook. I'm not thinking particularly carefully about where that content was produced.
Right.
And I think that we can get citizens in the country to think about where their content is produced, and that it needs to be produced by South Africans.
Yeah.
If you start to get people to understand that fact, that is very important and very powerful.
Yeah, well, that was a brief discussion, but an important one, and of course, to be part of it on social media, where it will continue. Hashtag SABC Media and Society. Thank you so much to our guests, Nelisa Ngulana, who is the founder of PR Trends ZA, and thanks as well to Kate Skinner from the Association of Independent Publishers. Thank you so much for watching our show, Media and Society, and we'll join you again, same time, same place next week. For me and the rest of the team, have yourselves a blessed Sunday.